Welcome to the Psychedelic Passage podcast. My name is Jimmy, your host. Thank you so much for joining us here for another week, another installment, another opportunity for me to rant and rave about all things psychedelic and psychedelic healing. Actually, I have a guest here today, so you all will be excited. I'll take a moment to introduce our guest, but I'll start this episode as I always do. First and foremost, just thank you. Thank you to our listeners. Thank you to the folks who have come across this podcast. Thank you to all the folks, the thousands of people that we've been able to serve and support. It's been so meaningful to know that any one of these rants or monologues or dialogues or conversations that I have with folks is helpful. So thank you all for being here. It means so much to me. And I would imagine also our guest today, who I first met just more as a colleague in the psychedelic space. And our guest today is Will van Derveer. So to share a little bit about Will van Derveer, MD, is a co-founder of Integrative Psychiatry Institute, offering comprehensive training for mental health professionals in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy and other continuing educational programs. This is an organization that I've been following for many years, maybe a half decade or longer, and following along with their work. Will is also a medical director of Integrative Psychiatry Center of Boulder, Colorado, which provides integrative psychiatry for a broad range of conditions and ketamine-assisted psychotherapy for treatment-resistant depression and PTSD. And in addition to his clinical practice and teaching, Will has been involved with clinical trials sponsored by MAPS, investigating MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for chronic treatment-resistant PTSD, which is had a breakthrough designation with the FDA, and that has ran into some hurdles as far as the timeline of approval of MDMA by the FDA. You have a book coming out, Psychedelic Therapy, Restore Your Health and Reclaim Your Life, that will be coming out in 2026. And then Dr. van Derveer is the co-host also of the Higher Practice podcast, where he explores what it takes to achieve optimal mental health, which we'll be talking a little bit about today. So, Will, thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast.
It's a great privilege to be here, Jimmy. Thank you so much.
I'm looking down memory lane, and we met a few years ago. I believe I was serving in a non-voting subcommittee role in one of the focus groups around the Natural Medicine Health Act. They had a whole bunch of different, modules handling all of different facets of rolling out Colorado's regulatory psychedelic-assisted therapy program. And one of them was licenses, qualifications, and training. And I think that's where I first met you, if
I think
correct.
that's right. I remember several of those conversations and just really appreciating your thoughtfulness and, the way you showed up for those meetings. It was an exciting time to be a part of that. Like you, I was a non-voting member of one of the same subcommittee, the training and licensing. So, and now here we are, right? And Colorado has their regulations in place.
Yeah, and one of the things that struck me about, I think, just the way that you carried yourself in some of those public hearings and working sessions is that, most folks are kind of drawing this dividing line between mental health and psychedelic care, almost as this like alternate to solve the failures of mental and medical health. And it's always very refreshing for me to see folks, who are doctors and mental health professionals. I know you're an MD who also has this understanding of the human-oriented side of this, like how does this actually affect people who are exploring their own healing, regardless of whether it's viewed as a mental health thing or a spiritual thing or a clinical thing or not. And so I wonder, just to start off, how did you find yourself in this role? So you're a doctor, and then over the past half decade plus, you've been focused on more psychedelic oriented initiatives. Can you share a little bit with the audience about how those two worlds merged for you?
Well, there have been some different chapters, so I'll try to be succinct here. When I was in medical school, I got to go and work in a hospital in India, and I found a meditation teacher there, and there were many things I learned in India, but one of the things was, just really appreciating how basic medical care of taking care of the basics when you don't have a lot of technology or a lot of money to throw at problems. There's a different approach that I saw there that stood in stark contrast to our like hyper technical, hyper expensive way of doing things over here. And I also came away with a meditation practice. And for a while, I thought that meditation was going to be, as I combined that with psychotherapy and with medications, I thought I would be able to cover the bases, but I was very incorrect about that. What I came to learn in the second chapter was that for my own personal healing path around my own traumas from childhood, that psychotherapy that I undertook and the meditation practice that I was doing were not enough for me to get most of my healing completed. And so there was a certain point in time where I was practicing Buddhist and I was meditating hours a day in my early 30s. And one of my friends in the Buddhist community invited me to an ayahuasca ceremony. And it happened to be on the night before Mother's Day. And the Peruvian shaman gave this incredible prayer to his mother, to all the mothers, Earth Mother, the mother of the river. And he went on and on for, it must have been like half an hour. And I just started bawling and it just cracked me wide open. And I realized that there was a lot that I hadn't worked through about the feelings I had about my own mother. And I was, probably in my late 30s at that time. It was very humbling. But it put me on a path. And so that put me into another phase of my life where I was going to South America and Central America and doing a lot of ceremony for my own healing and really appreciating this different way of getting well together. But it was very private and I was scared to talk about it with my colleagues and my patients. And it started to dawn on me that it didn't feel right ethically for me to be choosing a different way to get well from what I was talking about in my work with people.
I see. You're sharing about meditation and psychotherapy and medications, and here you are going down this whole alternate pathway.
Exactly.
Interesting. Yeah.
And it was around that time that I got invited to meet the team that was trying to start a MAP study for MDMA assisted therapy for severe PTSD, and participating in that study for a number of years and writing the paper with the other co-investigators led me to and just seeing the remarkable and pretty quick and pretty deep healing that happened there. We could talk about the results of that study, but basically 2/3 of the people no longer met criteria for PTSD, and these were folks who had on average about 30 years of symptoms before the study. Hundreds of therapy sessions. One person had more than 1,000 therapy sessions prior to entering the study. And so for 2/3 of those people to essentially get well was just totally mind-blowing. That was really my big introduction to it. I wasn't, in college, I wasn't a kid who went that far out. I smoked some weed, I drank alcohol, but I never got anywhere near MDMA or psychedelics.
As a kid who went pretty far out in college, you and I would have still been friends, I'm sure, maybe in our college years together. But I understand, like, this wasn't something that was built into your own life exploration and discovery, is what I'm taking away.
Yeah. Yeah, I grew up in Nashville in a relatively low-key, there was a lot going on in my home, but it wasn't like a, psychedelic-oriented community at all.
Yeah. Yeah, mine neither. I grew up on the south side of Chicago where there was none of that stuff going on. So if anything, drugs were used as a pathway for enforcement,
Wow.
I can understand or can imagine the little subcultures within our country have come a long way as far as the acknowledgement and acceptance of psychedelics, which is a part of why we are talking, which is a part of why there's folks like you who are doctors who are then finding themselves at this intersection of psychedelics, not only in your personal life, but there's many people who are kind of feeling like this, oh, it's okay, we could talk about mushrooms now, and it's okay, we could talk about feelings and healing and all of that stuff. So I'm looking forward to dropping into this conversation with you today. And as I'm hearing a little bit about your share, a couple of things struck me. I think one is it's pretty interesting to me how the experiencing of different cultures then informed how you serve and the way that you return back to this society and this world, which you probably has its own parallels to, like, Joseph Campbell's work, Hero's Journey. We did an episode on that, and it sounded like you were pretty influenced by your experiences in both India and from the legacies of like Peruvian medicine work. And one of the things you said was that when you went to India, you saw this stark contrast in how that country maybe addresses care as opposed to the U.S. Can you speak on that a little bit about what you actually experienced there that highlighted the stark contrast?
Well, there were two things that come to mind. I had this incredible mentor there who was so present and so connected with the people who came through the clinic. And I saw her healing through relationship, even though her position was primary care. I was in a primary care clinic. I wasn't doing mental health work there. It really blew me away how very simple conversations, making use of ordinary, everyday resources could accomplish a lot in that context. So that was huge. And then the other thing that really blew me away was a personal experience I had where I wanted to go to the place where the Dalai Lama lives in Dharamsala. I was on my way there, and this is a typical cocky, kind of dumb American tourist thing to do, but I was in Rishikesh on my way there, and I saw people doing ablutions in the river and going underwater. And I said, "Oh, I'm going to go do that." And so I went down to the river and I went underwater. And as I came up, I could see this bloated body of a cow floating right by me. And I thought, uh-oh, this probably isn't my, weak American gut microbiome and immune system's probably not going to do well with this. And sure enough, I was really sick the next day, but I was traveling too. And so I made it to Dharamsala, and I heard that there was an American in basically a refugee clinic who was seeing people there. And so I stood in line behind a bunch of Tibetan folks, and I got to the front of the line, and the guy said, "What are you doing here? This is only for refugees." And I said, "Look, I'm an American medical student. I'm super sick. I need antibiotics." And he prescribed a really strong antibiotic. And the next morning, my urine was the color of Coca-Cola.
Wow.
It was really scary, and I'd never seen that before. I heard that there was a Tibetan clinic where you could see a Tibetan doctor. And so I went there, and I knew that they analyze urine as a part of their practice, part of their tradition. So I showed him my urine, and he didn't speak English, but he had a translator who said, "Oh, are you taking American medicine?" And I said, "Yes." And the Tibetan doctor said, "If you keep taking that, it's going to kill your kidneys. And we're going to prescribe you some Tibetan medicine," which was herbal medicine. It's each little ball of medicine is harvested from the local fields in the Himalayas, and it's put in these little foil containers with little golden strings and with blessings on each one. He told me how to take the medicine. He said, "You're going to feel better in a week, but you need to take it for 3 weeks." I followed his program, and I felt better in a week, and I finished the program and didn't have any more problems. So I was, again, just really humbled by like how arrogant I felt as a Western medical student. And, we're the ones with the answers, and we've got the technology and all of this stuff. But actually the American technology was killing me. and
Hmm.
I don't know what would have happened if I kept going with that.
Hmm.
So I think I've always, I don't know, it was a deep thing in me as a child too, of curiosity about other cultures. And I was studying anthropology in college and, was just really interested in learning from other traditions.
Hmm. I think that's really fascinating that it was almost your arrogance was a vehicle for kind of discovering some of these truths that ended up being really impactful to the way that you live your life and the way that you serve, which is really just a nod for most people who are approaching psychedelics. And I'll comment to say that many people, in relation to your share, end up almost like pathologizing themselves, meaning that as they're searching for healing or well being or mental health improvement or fulfillment, any of those things, most people regard themselves as like, oh, there's something wrong that needs to be fixed, or there's something broken that needs to be healed, or all of this is rooted in this notion of like a disease that needs to be eradicated, which is,
Yeah.
pathology is the study of disease. And what ends up happening with a lot of folks is that, and I share this in one of my past, podcast episodes about how it's actually leaning into the things that make us who we are at the time that allows us to like grow into who we eventually are, to become. And so I also think that it's really wonderful that your experience almost not almost, very much did open you up to this world of herbal medicine and coming into relation with plants and medicines. And it was very, I receive you sharing about your ayahuasca circle and your relationship with your mother. Like, I hold that in a really, really soft spot in my heart. And I'm reminded of a friend of mine who is a regular guest on our podcast, Michaela De L'Amico, and she talks about this concept of rematriating entheogens, which means like, if all of these medicines and things are of the earth, then they are of our mothers. And so how do we return back to that? And her sense was like, protecting human rights is the same as protecting our right to explore psychedelics and heal is the same as protecting our lakes and rivers and land. And so I can't help but think about that theme that's kind of showing up in your share as well.
Yeah, it's a really interesting push pull, I think, between a culture and the themes of our culture that you're talking about, of pathologizing, of regarding the molecule as the healing agent, as opposed to the molecule as supporting the healing that is happening relationally or spiritually. That culture, I think it's fair to say, would seek to put these psychedelic compounds in the same category and to define them as such. The healing is the ketamine, the healing is the DMT, the healing is the psilocybin, as opposed to what made sense to me about the 10 years that I spent really deep in the work with ayahuasca is that the healing is about restoring relationships between that are broken, maybe between me and the earth or between me and my relations, my
Mm,
ancestors, and so on. So it's tough because on the one hand, we're kind of entering this hourglass, right? This kind of funnel of regulatory adoption, or let's say trying to get this way of healing into the mainstream. And yet at the same time, I think we have to hold this more of this view that you're talking about and keep protecting the sacred ancient ways of understanding what healing is and can be. And it's not easy. It's not easy and it's not clear.
yeah, some folks regard psychedelics as ancient technologies as opposed to these, modern technologies, as you
Right.
mentioned, via medication and things like that. And obviously, we're not talking in absolutes here. There are wonders of scientific and medical advancement with
Of course.
screenings and diagnostics and all of that. And my large takeaway of your share is that you have found yourself at maybe at odds with these almost different like polar opposites of how people regard this, like this westernized, medicalized approach versus something that is more akin to community and is a little bit more relational and is a little bit more environmental. So talk to me about that. So then you went back, you were a medical student at the time, you became a doctor sometime around there, you started to work with grandmother medicine. And how did you reconcile, or where was your balance point in trying to find your genuine way of service? You were noting
Mhm.
before, like, oh, here's the advice I'm giving people in the doctor's office, in the clinic, but then here's the thing that I'm doing. So tell me how that all came together.
Well, I'm laughing because there've been these moments where I was hoping that I could make my life a lot more simple. For example, when I came out of my training in psychiatry, I opened a practice and I was teaching meditation to people. I was doing psychotherapy, I was prescribing medication, and I thought, okay, I've got most answers for most people, this is great. But over the course of the next 2 years, I got more and more discouraged and entered this deep place of despair, really. And it was around noticing that people who were on this carousel of, changing out one medication for another one, and it's not working, and it used to work and now it doesn't work. And this whole view really didn't serve enough people. It served some people. And when it serves people well, it's great. The problem is that most people don't get served well. And I say most as in like more than 50% of people don't get a good result from that approach. And so I quit psychiatry 2 years after I started. And I thought, well, here's how I'm going to simplify my life. I'm going to be a meditation guy, and maybe I'll teach meditation. And then I ran into a former patient who was one of the people who hadn't gotten much out of the work with me. And he told me that after I left town, he got tested for celiac disease, which is a wheat allergy. And he stopped eating wheat, and slowly his anxiety disappeared over 6 weeks. And then he stopped the medication I had him on, and he still had no anxiety. And to this day,
Mm.
he still has no anxiety.
Mm.
So that woke me up and made my life more complicated. I need to go back and
Sure.
get more education.
I thought I
Like,
was on the right path, and
yeah.
here I am making a pivot. Yeah.
And then I had another one where I was so deep in the work with this medicine community from this Peruvian teacher, and I thought I was going to leave psychiatry again and be an apprentice to this shamanic teacher. And I kept going to ceremony with a prayer to ask, is this the path for me? And the response I kept getting from the medicine was, look, we have enough apprentices here. We need bridges to people who haven't been exposed to this way of healing. And, that's what we need. And that I would go back over and over again and get the same message. And after a while, I was like, okay, like I accept my assignment. And so that's what I've been doing is really committing to the multiplicity. I mean, in psychedelic medicine, we talk a lot about that multiplicity, right? There can
Mm.
be so many different things going on for a client all at the same time. And
Mm.
I think that's true on the outside as much as it is on the inside. And so when someone needs a really high tech treatment like, ECT or TMS or something like that, I 100% support that. And I'll refer people for that. I really believe in that. But there are so many other ways to get well too. And so that's where I just plant my flag is like, let's be humble. Let's look for answers. And, for one person, Chinese medicine is going to be the cat's meow. For someone else, it's a different way.
I talk a lot about autonomy and sovereignty in people reclaiming their power and choosing what is right for them. And what has dawned on me is that it is a very privileged statement to say that people have a right to choose, because that assumes that people have choices available and present to them. And there's a whole disparity of accessibility and education and all of that. And what you're sharing kind of reminds me of something you said earlier in your personal, story, where you were like, I thought the secret combination was going to be psychotherapy and medication and meditation, and then you didn't exactly say it this way, but my takeaway was like psychotherapy wasn't enough on its own, meditation wasn't enough on its own, medication or medicines, whether an SSRI or 4 grams of psilocybin mushrooms, likely on their own or not enough.
Right.
And so yeah, I would love to get your thoughts on, I'm getting a better understanding of, how you came to be and how you serve. And what does that bridge look like for you? Not only building a bridge towards, I'll just call it as an umbrella, the medicine ways, right? The psychedelic way, the community oriented style of healing. But I imagine that bridge is a little bit of like a two-way street. And I think that as you were discussing, you were talking a little bit about the limitations and the pitfalls of all of these, categories. And one thing that I really appreciated that you said is that in your stance, and I agree with this, I don't demonize any type of pathway or option or alternative, outcome that people can seek. So what does this look like for folks? Maybe there are folks who have been through a lot of therapy or they were, on that carousel of medications. Like what does the impact of psychedelics in our modern society? What does that do for their healing process?
I think so much of it depends on the frame. And that's why I think it's so critical that we hold the frame of these experiences with so much care. For example, what we see a lot in the work that we do with treatment-resistant depression and our work with ketamine is that we often encounter folks who have been in the mental health system for a long time, and they've tried a lot of different things. They've tried different medications, different therapies, and they've been taught that treatment-resistant depression is kind of like a biological condition that is just, you treat it with medication, and if you're not on medication, you're taking huge risks, basically. And when I was in training, I was taught to tell people that, like you got to stay on your medication, and so on. As opposed to a different frame, and the frame that I prefer working with people on is psychedelic medicine. The dosing session, it's an evocative treatment. It's not a suppressive treatment. So suppressive treatments like Prozac, allow people to cope by turning down the severity
By
of
dampening things down, giving folks a little bit of a buffer towards very extreme emotions or states of beings as a way towards finding stability. And
yeah,
then in the expressive way, these are more in the regard of actually expressing or letting it out or evoking or living these things as a way of processing. And there's this whole parallel of like ecstatic mysticism or even like somatic experiencing or some
yeah,
of those things that all find a home within this expressive world.
exactly. Yeah. One of the big challenges is that we live in this culture that is, and it's a suppressive culture, right? We don't grieve in an expressive way. I'm trying to remember that Beatles song line about or maybe I guess it's Pink Floyd. Quiet desperation is the English way.
Mm.
I think there's a cost to talk about in cultural sensitivity work, like tone policing. Like as a part of our culture, we have a huge intolerance to loud voices, to expressive releases of trauma, to really feeling deeply and expressing feelings.
Especially for men in our society. There's this notion, whether explicitly stated or understood, that if you're letting out some emotion or letting out some expression or something, you are, weaker than. I was just experiencing this in a text group I have with some of my childhood friends. We had a childhood friend of mine who passed away, and at their wake, just looking at my friend's chat, it was like, oh, they did pretty well. They held it together. They did pretty good. Like, oh, it was so hard to see folks cry, or this person was very stoic. And these are the things that we reward in our society. So my ADHD brain might be arriving at your point before you express it, but what's coming up for me is like the things that are happening in medical mental health is actually an effect of what's happening in our society and culture.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. My sister says it this way, "I'm fine, you're fine, we're fine."
Yeah. I reminded of there's like a dog meme where that's like drinking a cup of coffee while like the house is on fire. It's like it's fine. This is fine. And when I'm fine, you're fine, we're fine becomes the norm, then what happens?
Well, I would say then our rates of mental or mental, I don't wanna say mental illness because that's a whole construct, but, like, the suffering that we feel escalates. It has to. If
Mhm.
if there's no room, for us to express or to feel, and it's kinda hard to, I mean, I think, people who are listening who have had a psychedelic experience where you feel wide open or you feel like, colors are more vivid the next day, it's like having a psychological straitjacket blown off your body that you didn't know you had on, and all of a sudden you realize that, oh, you've been contracted in ways that you didn't even know, and that's socially enforced. So yeah, exactly what you were saying, that the medical system is just a reflection of the culture. So there is this huge opportunity when we frame these experiences as opportunities to look at the straitjacket or look at the lenses that we wear in our culture. The challenge that we see in integration a lot is a person could have that opening in a dosing session, and now they've got a whole context that they're going home to that is not different from the one they stepped out of for the dosing session. And so all of these inputs are needing to get worked with, and that's a heavy burden for someone to bear after a healing session, to try to deconstruct and rebuild a life that allows the room for all of that vividness to really unfold, you know?
Hmm. Yeah, my distant friend and somebody that I've admired their work, Danielle Herrera, I heard her say one time in a talk that we don't want to use psychedelics just to condition people back into systems of harm.
Yeah,
And I think that we find for many folks who go and even have these potentially wonderful healing experiences, or people who find healing through the really hard ones, like I have, and then they go back into the same aquarium that they've been living in, proverbially with the
yeah,
same stuff and the same things, and lo and behold, they're right back. They're right back to it.
yeah, yeah. It's really painful, and I hope that we can reach a tipping point where enough people have had enough openings and continue to support each other. Talk about community. I mean, I think we're not taking enough advantage of community relationships to hold people in the aftercare after these experiences. And it's interesting that, and this is not a ding against MAPS, but it's probably more of a procedural thing with
You
FDA
can ding
studies.
maps if you want. I have a pretty open, criticism and love for
Okay.
maps and all my friends there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm very grateful for the work and the personal experience the privilege I got to have to provide MDMA therapy, and all the things I learned from that and what I saw in the participants, and really just the vision that Rick Doblin and Michael Mithofer and all the folks
Mhm.
held there. So I really do tip my hat to them. And one of the things that came up in our study was people saying, "Wait a second, why can't we talk to each other, the participants?" A number of them asked that, like, where's the community circle to share our
Mhm.
experiences and support one another? And it was not in the protocol, you know? And in theory, supporting that, if it were off protocol, which it was, could alter the results of the study. And so the study wasn't designed for that.
The study in itself already had a whole bunch of, like, multivariable things to account
Yeah,
for, not the same
exactly.
investigators, not the same
Totally.
locations, and yeah, so
Exactly.
there was
Exactly.
a benefit to standardizing some of it, so I can see
Exactly.
that was a hard choice to make, probably.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, anyway, I think it's interesting that there was a natural desire for that was
Mm.
voiced by people.
That's ultimately what I found in my own, pathway and trying to, I think we are in similar places, and I'd love to talk about, your projects over the past couple of years. And what I find is that you have had this emphasis and focus on, training good practitioners and things like that. I have been more focused on like connecting people to, practitioners, and ultimately everything always circles back to community. Like every time I have a question or an answer, like what's missing or it's like always community. And I've been circling back on this for years and years and years. And it's something that folks ask for when they go through, one of our programs and things like that. And also find this in my own psychedelic experience is that for many folks, they're asking, will this work for me? Will this not? What are the rates of success? That's my favorite question when people ask. And though I don't want to oversimplify it, I theorize that it all really points to one road, which is how do we relate? How do we relate to ourselves? How do we relate to our loved ones? How do we relate to the people around us? How do we relate to the world? And I think that when folks can find that way of relating, which you were talking about, like how do I relate to these herbs and these medicines, and like even just having a simple, caring conversation can be really healing. I think that that's such a powerful aspect in psychedelic work. And so I'm just curious for you, Will, what do you feel is needed for the psychedelic healing to successfully enter the mainstream? You've talked a little bit about some limitations and pitfalls. I think we've talked a little bit about things to be aware of as this all comes online. I think we've also talked a little bit about the potential. And you've been at this really hands-on for many years. Where does this go? What do you think this space needs?
Hmm. It's a great question. Thanks. Thanks for. I love the way you interview. It's really great to be here and just have a conversation with you. I think that we have a lot of work to do on a cultural level. The perceptions about psychedelic healing are pretty distorted from propaganda, from the Controlled Substance Act of Richard Nixon and so on, policies around incarceration and mandatory minimum and the drug war and so on. The fear really, and I can relate to it personally. I was scared to death of having a psychedelic experience. I drank the Kool-Aid of Nancy Reagan and don't do drugs and dare and all that stuff. And I thought you would go crazy and never come back if you did that.
Mhm.
But I also didn't know how at the time, growing up, I didn't know in the privileged white community I was a part of how much fear people of color had about these compounds, around incarceration and so on. So there's just massive layers of historical narrative and trauma that we're going to need to, gradually and carefully unwind together to make this a really, truly mainstream thing. My hope is that if we can roll out regulated models where people start to have profound healing experiences that they can tell their friends about, over time, we'll just shift the narrative. But I think it's going to take probably decades, honestly,
Mhm.
for that to unroll. And so I can't remember which psychedelic healer it was, leader, kind of pioneer. I think it might have been Stan Groff who said I think he was talking to one of his students and said, "Don't fuck it up." That's really the the message. Because if we have bad outcomes, we have deaths, we have we have sexual transgression, which of course has happened before. We could screw it up, and it could go off the rails, and we could be behind another regulatory 8 ball again.
Yeah, it's a real challenge for people who are in our seats who have experienced firsthand the benefit to our own healing in our lives and are also taking it upon us to progress this forward we, like you were alluding to before, we're standing on shoulders of giants for sure. And there's a lot of folks, out there doing that. And it's this challenge of what I've kind of coined this psychedelic halo effect, meaning that there can be this desire to talk about all of the positive aspects and the benefits and the potential of psychedelics, but then to diminish things like natural harm and harm reduction and potential risks and all of that. And I find that sometimes there's a little bit of like propaganda, type of thing to only talk about the positive things about, psychedelics, where I think it's just worth having earnest conversations with people, so that they can understand what they're getting into and what's possible and not. And my takeaway from what you were saying a moment ago, Will, when you were like highlighting this the work that we need to do in Black and brown populations and things like that, is that we need examples, like we need models, we need things that we can reference. You went to India and got sick, and so you had that lived experience that you can reference, which then informs the rest of the decisions in your life. And many folks, myself included, my parents came over here from Vietnam as refugees. Like, I didn't have like uncles and aunts and things who were like doing psychedelics. And many of my friends, on the south side of Chicago, like, we don't have the example of the brother or the aunt or the cousin who used psychedelics in this way and it healed them.
Yeah.
Most of the time it's like, I got caught with possession, or I
Yeah.
went and did, jail time, or, those things. And so I think that modeling is so, so, so important. I'm really appreciative of, I can see you trying to do that, both in your real life and your professional life. Well, I shouldn't characterize it as real life and professional life, but, both in your personal and professional. And I think as in the theme of this, like modeling the healing process or modeling intentional use of psychedelics, I think a part of this is also people are looking to professional services and facilitators and those folks as those subject matter experts, as the knowledgeable folks, as the models. And I know that with IPI, Integrative Psychiatry Institute, you all have been focused quite a bit on training.
Yeah.
Is that right? So can you tell me a little bit about this? My understanding is that you all have been doing more like certificate level training programs for clinicians, but usually folks who have some type of mental health, medical licensure. And then you moved into offering some of that training through Oregon's program, I think Colorado as well. Can you just tell us a little bit about that work and why? Why is that such a focus for you?
Well, thanks, Jimmy. Yeah, we started the institute in 2018, originally focused entirely on integrative medicine for mental health care. So we were teaching prescribers this broader base of tools, gut-brain connection, how to address inflammation, how to use supplements and natural remedies instead of medication, how to taper people off medication effectively, really understanding the evidence base, because there are studies on a lot of different things that you don't run across it in conventional training mechanisms. So that was the original view, was that conventional mental health care is incredibly limited, and we wanted to start with that. So we trained prescribers for several years in a year-long training doing that. And then we mostly transitioned to focusing on our energy on this year-long psychedelic therapy training program that is exactly the way you described it. It's for people with mental health care licenses. So anything from psychiatry to psychiatric nurse practitioner, psychotherapist. And the reason we did that is we really just recognized such a huge need for really effective facilitators in the space. And we knew that there were a few really small programs around. Like, I have a lot of respect for Janice Phelps and California Institute of Integral Studies, CIS, huge pioneers in the work, in the space, the training space. There were problems with people getting trained at MAPS, just not enough availability. But overall, the other thing that I noticed was there wasn't a place where you could train and have your own personal experiences with psychedelics as a part
Mm-hmm.
of your training. I know in conventional circles, there's some debate about whether that's necessary or not, but probably your audience would embrace the idea that probably you and I embrace, is that it's kind of inconceivable to put yourself out there as a facilitator of this work if the inner landscape inside of yourself you haven't explored very much.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Yeah, and I think that that goes beyond just having the psychedelic experience, because one of the things that I find really remarkable about the MDMA studies through MAPS is that usually when they're trying to get the FDA to deschedule something, it's just about the substance itself. It's
Yeah.
very unusual for that to be in conjunction. They're saying that MDMA in conjunction with a certain style of psychotherapy is what is proving effective. And that's, you've been kind of sharing that theme throughout, that it's likely more than just having the psychedelic experience but doing your work. And the analogy I share with folks is like, I don't want a pilot who's only done the classwork and the simulation.
Right.
I
Exactly.
want them in the plane and having had flown a couple times.
100%. Yeah, it's a good analogy for sure. So we got involved in Oregon when the state measure passed up there, and service centers became available as something you could create. So we did that in 2023, and I think we've had about maybe 500 people go through the practicum experiences we have up there, which is really cool.
Mm. The experiential, like supporting each other through
Exactly.
actual experiences, yeah.
Yeah, in a
Mhm.
group dosing format. So it's really exciting to see people who many haven't ever had a psychedelic experience before, and they're going to a group experience and they're having a psilocybin experience, and deeply powerful. It's by far the most meaningful part of the training program, I would say, is
Yeah.
is, is what the students say on the way out. So that is where we're doing the psilocybin work, and then we also have an optional ketamine practicum that we have here in Colorado. And hopefully, I mean, if MDMA ever gets approved and there's a pathway for trainees to have MDMA experiences, then we'll try and offer that too. And that's way down the road, it seems, at this point.
Yeah, for folks who are not updated with this, the FDA's formal recommendation was to basically go through another clinical trial, which will take many years and a lot of funding. I mean, this stuff takes tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars just to even get these things reviewed by the FDA. And so I appreciate you sharing that as well. And I like, the emphasis that you all are taking about focusing on the experiential and, that internal work. And I'll tell you, my least favorite and my favorite type of psychedelic therapist, I would say my least favorite is the one who's had one psychedelic experience and they're like, all right, I'm ready to do this work. And probably my favorite is maybe the one who's had many, many psychedelic experiences and they're like, I still have a lot to learn. And so I'm appreciative of you, Will, bringing your own like personal lens and personal life experience. And I applaud you for trying to find a way of like, okay, how do I be a bridge? Like, how do I like merge these worlds? What's happening for me as a human? And how do I bring that into my own, healing practice? And so I would imagine that, your IPI programs, have some of that too. Yeah. Do you have, any thoughts about how this relates to folks, exploring, psychedelics now? One thing that I try to share with folks is that a lot of these services and pathways are emerging, right? Like a few years ago, we didn't have regulatory programs. Now we have,
Yeah.
four that are emerging: Oregon, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico. What else is important for people to know if they're psychedelic curious and at this certain kind of in between time where things are coming online, but like not quite?
Yeah. Well, it's a tender moment and it's really exciting. There's a lot of good news happening around as you said, now it's way past Colorado and Oregon, and we're into other states, and there's other states that are considering measures, and at the same time, we're still in a prohibition environment, and so at the risk of sounding paternalistic, I want to remind people that these medicines. Please test the medicine if you're going to take something that you buy in an unofficial way. You just need to be smart about that. Yeah, I guess the other thing is that if you're vetting someone to sit with you, to be a facilitator with you, I think word of mouth and having someone that you know and trust who's had a good experience with that person is really, really important. You don't want to go shopping for a psychedelic guide on Google. I mean, it's the relationships are critical here, is all I'm trying to say. And I guess, the other thing, and to your point about emphasizing the potential harms and the risks, I think it's really important to just say it out loud that psychedelics are not for everyone,
Mm.
and they're not a silver bullet for every kind of problem you could ever imagine. And some journeys are really hard to integrate. There are people who I have close personal friends who have struggled for months or in some cases up to a year to try to work through something that came up on a journey. So powerful tools have to come with a lot of humility and
Mhm.
care for the risks.
Yeah, that last part that you shared just reminds me of this whole theme of our conversation about how do we attune this type of work to our society today, where in I would imagine a lot of the ancient ways of doing this. I shouldn't even say ancient, just the very alive cultures that are not America, North America, the United States of America, and doing this work. They have different cultural concepts of time and community and productivity and participation. And so I'll speak broadly. This isn't for every culture. I don't know all of them, and nor would I pretend to know. But oftentimes, if you were going through a dark night of the soul experience where you were destabilized for a period of time because you are confronting all of the beliefs and affirmations and stories that you told yourself in your life, then usually community would hold you. They'd care for you and they would nurture you and they'd make sure that you were fed and then you would have a little space from work. But here in our society, you got to clock back into work on Monday,
That's right.
or your kids still need to get picked up,
Yeah.
or these chores need to get done, or whatnot. And so I think that that's really powerful because of this thing that you had said previously, which my take on it is like the tools kind of don't matter if the treatment of it is the same.
Yeah. Exactly.
And the analogy of like, well, if you have a hammer, then everything's going to be a nail. And so in that regard, does it matter if you're on a psychotropic medication, Wellbutrin or Prozac or Zoloft or any of those versus a psychedelic medicine if you're treating it the same? And so I really just want to highlight, I think, that real big piece of wisdom for you, which is like, let's look at the whole human and then find all of the different facets on how do we create more pathways of healing for folks.
Absolutely. I think we're really aligned on the view of supporting people to find their sovereignty and
Hmm.
find their empowerment. I had the privilege of spending some time with Richard Schwartz from IFS recently, and
Hmm.
he was talking.
Internal family systems for folks, sometimes called parts work, very compatible with psychedelic work for sure.
Yeah, thanks, Jimmy. I shouldn't have used the acronym, but yeah, the internal family systems is an interesting model. I was really struck by Dick Schwartz talking about parts of us that might be depressed, or parts of us that might be suicidal, parts of us that might be addicted to a substance or a relationship or a particular, maladaptive set of behaviors. And I just think there's so many different ways we could be thinking about what we're struggling with.
Mhm.
as opposed to what you were talking about in the beginning, this pathology model of I'm broken, I have a mental illness.
Something's wrong with me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I think the most important thing that we can do as healers is to take a stand for possibility of healing, that
Mm,
people given the right set of circumstances and the right supports and frankly the right challenges too can get strong.
mm,
You can recover.
mm,
And not every condition is recoverable by every circumstance, but if we take the view that there's no more that we could do, or this person's at the end of their road, or so on and so on, like, what good is that?
mhm,
Even if it's the wrong assumption to assume that we haven't looked under every stone, wouldn't you want to keep doing it? You know?
mhm.
So I think that that's again, just it's a cultural narrative that we have to keep dismantling.
Yeah. I know that's right in my own lived experience as I was trying to handle things in secret or didn't feel like I could talk about this openly because it would make me less than or less of a man or people thinking I'm unstable or not trustworthy or too much of a problem. And I think folks in this audience and community know that I've been very suicidal, through my life. And for a long time, it was this notion of like, that is a demon. That thing needs to go away. That thing is out to harm me. Like, how do I dampen this thing or make myself impervious to this thing? And it wasn't actually until I invited that part of me in
Mm,
to actually understand that that was a part of me that was crying out, that was actually asking for help. And then for me to get my own support and my own courage and bravery and model to like invite that
mm,
part of me into my heart
wow.
so that we can all heal together. That opportunity came through psychedelics, but then it was me who had to keep leaning into that with my heart open. And
Mm,
so thanks for sharing that, Will. As we wrap up this episode here, I wonder if I can come out of left field and maybe ask you just some more basic like Q&A things that I think might be helpful for
right?
our audience. That was a great conversation, by the way, and I hope that our community feels like the depth of what we're expressing and that people get to take away something. But I got a couple more like straightforward ones in
Right.
the effort of tangible, practical, things.
Yeah.
So are you ready for maybe like a couple of questions here?
Let's do it.
I know we didn't chat about it before, but
No, I'm
I'll ask
down.
you here. Okay. Do you have any advice for people who are interested in psychedelics and they maybe want to talk to their doctor or their mental
Mhm.
health professional or whatnot? Just like, what would you tell somebody if they were kind of in those shoes?
Yeah. It's kind of interesting because the roles might be reversed there, where the licensed professional might be the one who is in need, you know, of information, let's say. So taking the position of curiosity, I think always is a good start in terms. So for example, to make it really concrete, asking your practitioner, your provider, have you heard of about the research on psychedelics for addressing X, Y, and Z? Are you familiar with that? Did you read Michael Pollan's book in 2017, How to Change Your Mind? How do you feel about the emerging research coming out? If you find that the person you're working with is really afraid of these tools, then, you might want to find out if there's other practitioners in your area that you could work with. So you could be more open about your curiosity and have, more of a conversation. I will say that a lot of professionals who used to be very opposed to psychedelic healing have been opened up quite a bit over the last
Mm,
10 years with all of this clinical research happening. So sometimes people I talk to who have that difficult conversation are very surprised to find out that their practitioner is actually embracing that or
mm.
looking into it or curious about it. Yeah, that's where I would start. I probably wouldn't start with like a big reveal like
Test the waters a little bit is what I'm hearing.
yeah.
Test the water for temperament first, and then maybe test for competency.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, and I think that we run into that when we chat with folks all the time who are like, I spoke about this with my mental health professional or medical, provider, and they were neither for or against, or they were indifferent, or they didn't have enough experience, so just kind of like left at the same, starting block. So, what are resources for those folks? Maybe people who
Yeah.
have already chatted with their mental health medical professional, and then they kind of didn't materialize as something. Like, what would you suggest for folks there?
And we're talking about the person in the client role at this.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and what
Mhm.
kind of resources they could access?
Yeah. Mhm.
Well,
Mhm.
I would send them to your website for one thing.
I appreciate that. Yeah. Thank you.
There's a
Uh-huh.
lot of good information there. There's good information on our website, psychedelicinstitute.com. They can read blogs and listen to podcast episodes and so on. I would say this new book that we're putting out in January, hopefully you and I can come back and talk more about it.
Yeah. I'd love to have that.
There are good books out there already for people to check out. I would say James Fadiman's book, The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide,
Mhm.
is worthwhile and pretty balanced, I think.
So it sounds like you're leaning more in towards the educate yourself and get knowledgeable, probably even before exploring a pathway or an action plan.
I think so. And then maybe you start talking to friends that you can trust about, asking
Mm.
questions about their experience. Have they had experiences with psychedelics or not? How did that go? What were the circumstances and so on? Hopefully, things will keep evolving, state by state over the course of the next few years. And of course, we're hoping that some of these phase 3 studies that are happening right now with psilocybin and others that are getting LSD for anxiety and so on will progress quickly. We'll see.
Yeah. That's official advice from a medical doctor, folks. So if you are psychedelic curious, you better follow those steps. I'm obviously joking, and I don't want to put anything you're saying for you at risk. But I think that this is really solid advice for folks. So thanks for that. I'll end with just one more overarching question, regardless of whether people explore psychedelics or not. In your opinion, what's the number one thing that people can do to better their mental health or medical health or just their well-being in general? If you could pinpoint, I know it's super
Mm.
hard because there's a lot it's multi-factor, like you said, but what arises to the surface internally for you when I ask that question?
Well, I think what I've been exploring over the last few years is the places where in my growth as a human being where I don't see possibility. And that can be subtle or it can be really significant. So sometimes we get a message, whether it's on a psychedelic journey or some other format, we get a message that it's time for a big change in our life. And maybe we're afraid to make that change, or we're afraid to even acknowledge that that message is coming in. We're afraid to talk about it. And I just want to encourage people to remember that life is short and
Mm.
the road isn't straight for almost any of us. I don't know anybody where the spiritual growth path or the human path is straight and narrow. I just invite people to be a student in life and be in the not knowing of where is it going. And another reminder that comes up for me along those lines is how little control we actually do have over our lives. I tend to drift into a terrible nightmare where I think it's all my responsibility and I'm in charge, and then I get my legs cut out from under me again. So
Sure.
I think it's a little better. I have a story that it might be better if I could maintain the perspective that, I might have a few percentage points of control over where
Sure.
things go. But
Yeah.
there's a lot that we don't understand, and there's a big mystery. And it would be kind of sad if that mystery wasn't in charge, because
Mhm.
then I think maybe our ego would be in charge, and that's a really scary idea.
It would make for probably a more boring human experience at a
Exactly.
minimum. And
Exactly.
I really appreciate what you're sharing here, and thank you for bringing your perspective into, this conversation as well. Yeah, I find that trying to maintain the illusion of control or maintain the illusion of perfection. So many people are like, well, I've tried everything for 20 years, 30 years. Now I got to get psychedelics right. If I don't do it a certain way, if I don't get it right,
Right.
then I'm going to fail, or I'll never love myself, or I'll never feel fulfilled, or I'll never heal, right? And I thank you for modeling your story, because it seemed like it was quite a non-linear path for you. And I hope that folks can see that and know that you can jump into a river and get infected and get really, really sick, and that actually be a direct pathway towards your healing. So I think that's really powerful. So thank you so much, Will. We'll put your information out there. I know folks can find you at psychiatryinstitute.com. You're on X at Will Vanderveer, and then you're on Instagram as well at will.vanderveer.md. Thank you so much for being on the episode with us.
Thanks so much, Jimmy. It's been a real pleasure, and I look forward to more conversation with you in the future.
Awesome. Well, that wraps up this episode of the Psychedelic Passage podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in with us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.